Stugotz, I had a lot of former ESPN people, current ESPN people, people in general asking me about what happened with Pat McAfee and Norby Williamson. For the uninitiated, Pat McAfee called him a rat and accused him of sabotage, which is fairly amazing. Just the accusation of
right after
sabotage, like I associate with like Russian hacking and stuff. You don't often see a public claim of I was sabotaged, but ESPN has hired a professional wrestler, and he's going to be a professional wrestler. And I should say on the front end, I root for Pat McAfee. I root for ESPN slightly less than I root for Pat McAfee. But what I found interesting about this is how people maintain and protect power and the roots of the industry and the way ESPN manages to oversee its talent and keep its talent under check.
And ESPN put out a statement in the wake of this new controversy that Pat McAfee embroiled himself in, and it said positive things about Norby Williamson, said they were going to handle the matter internally. And right now I'm looking up at the Pat McAfee Show. Pat is doing his show from the side of the CFP finals, so that would mean, and I know it's a big day for ESPN, it would mean that Pat McAfee seemingly got away, optically anyways, got away with calling a senior management type a disparaging name.
Not
for now.
Wait, hold on a second. Not a senior management type. Jemele and I can speak to this part. The guy who runs ESPN, the shadow president, the guy who keeps all of the. This isn't just a vice president. This is the guy who's run on the wrong side of Stuart Scott and Dan Patrick, and in general, this is not a bug. This is a feature. This is how you keep people controlled when you don't want your talent misbehaving, and the talent can be disposable, and you want the letters to matter more than anything else. So we bring in Jemele Hill here. Excuse me. That was a terrible way to pronounce your
long
name.
night, Dano.
It was a long night.
Yep.
Thank you, Stugotz.
It's Hill.
Thank you. And I found most of this funny. I found it interesting. Your takeaway as you watched it happen was what?
I think I was pretty amused by it as well because, as you mentioned, Dan, like this is just something that you just never see, and especially at a place like ESPN, where there's sort of an unofficial cardinal rule about talent on talent crime or letting what is happening in the building spill out into public arenas in the way in which Pat McAfee did. I mean, I've never seen that in the history of this network, that somebody just took a flamethrower to one of the executives there who has been there forever. You know, everybody knows who Norby is. And there was a part of me, I know everybody saw my tweet when I said I can relate. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. Is that, I mean, what happened to Mike and I on the 6 o'clock Sports Center, one day I hope will be a case study for media classes everywhere. And certainly toward the end of our time there, we experienced a lot of what Pat McAfee was talking about. And so that is the part that I could certainly relate to. But yeah, I mean, it's just, the thing is, where did they go from here? Because you have somebody, and as much as they try to create a separation between themselves and Pat McAfee by saying like, this is his own outfit, you know, they're sort of just renting the property and giving it a platform. It's like, it's on ESPN. People know that this is your show. So trying to have these kind of, trying to make it seem like there's some nuance there where the average person understands that, you know, how this business arrangement works is kind of, you know, a bit of a fallacy. So if you're a talent there at ESPN and you've seen this happen, that is going to probably give you a little more sense of empowerment, thinking that, okay, so the next time that something happens that, a conflict sort of spills out, and particularly dealing with this person in general, or really anybody there that's an executive, criticizing the company publicly is now open for business. Because if they don't do anything to Pat McAfee, and I'm not even suggesting anything should be done to Pat McAfee, but the reality is that this is setting a precedent in real time. And certainly I know in times where I've gotten into conflicts at ESPN, I have used precedent on my side to say, oh, but you let such and such do it. You let such and such get away with it. So this is very much a watershed moment in terms of how internal conflict is handled in a public manner.
Jemele, I think Pat can do it. Most can't.
No, nobody else can. This is
No,
what
nobody else
right.
can do this.
No,
No, you're completely right, but that doesn't matter because see, here's the thing and you all know this, when you're in the building and you're working for them, they try to sell you on the idea that everybody is treated the same. And we know everybody is not treated the same. And what this does is that this is going to give somebody down the road a lot of leverage in terms of how they have maybe dealt with some of the conflicts that have arisen there. And no, it's true. Like everybody we know is not treated the same. And how you're treated depends on how much leverage you have. And Pat McAfee has an awful lot of leverage, which is why he called his shot. That's why he did it to begin with, because he already knew what the outcome would be. Any battle that I picked in ESPN, I either knew I was going to win or I was okay with losing. One of those two. And he knew he would probably win this battle, which is why he did it.
He picked pretty incredible timing, because I know from my experience with Dan, when you get caught up in multiple instances like this in a very short period of time, that's when the writing started being on the wall for us. But Pat did this at a time coming off of probably the biggest heat that he'd had internally at ESPN with the Rodgers, Jimmy Kimmel thing. Granted, he's positioned as an innocent bystander, whether you believe that or not. So he does this thing about Norby, and he has his direct relationships with Jimmy Pitaro. He's got great relationships there with Kirk Herbstreit.
No, with Iger.
And
He's got a
Iger as well
relationship
has been
with
photographed.
Iger.
And he does
Right,
this.
and also Burt Magnus too. Like that's also him as well.
So he does this right before the CFP final on a day that's huge, and he's an integral part of their college football coverage. But to me, it's sensational headlines. ESPN talent calls senior executive a rat. I get all that. But there is an issue with ESPN and leaking. There has been for several years. And we know how many middle management types and upper management types have filtered through there. We know how many talents have cycled through ESPN. And yet, the leaks persist. They keep going to the same two reporters, and they're of the same nature. And I know from participating in their compliance training and in town halls and having senior management tell me directly how important it is to Disney to not be leaking things out. And yet in this statement, there is nothing about this leak. They would seem to have a serial leaker leaking constantly privileged information, and yet they're doing nothing about it.
Norby Williamson was the first name in that press release from ESPN. It was protecting him. I believe that these people did this to us at the end with a series of strategic, orchestrated leaks. And it's obviously to control the narrative. But Jemele, when I talk about this being a feature, not a bug, because you talk about precedent. Like I said, Dan Patrick wanted a television in his office before the biggest show they've ever had, just to have it. And they told him no. Because if he got a television in his office, then everyone would want a television in their office. And what I heard all the time is we cannot establish precedents. But the way that you tell me if I'm wrong about anything that I'm saying here, Jemele. When I saw you in Bristol, the first time you were at a cubicle, I was surprised by how small everything was. I was surprised by producers running the company. And the way that power gets kept is by making all of the talent disposable, not allowing for anything in the way of precedence. But the match that they now have, this is not some scared, insecure journalist in the vanity business who's interested in respecting authority. This is a guy who's got all his own powers and is renting to them. Like, he will be bigger the moment that he leaves there because he was too hot for Disney to handle than he was at any point before that. He has nothing to fear here. And that has to scare the hell out of them when the new media becomes about the Shannon Sharps and the McAfees and the athletes who aren't going to tolerate a middle manager or a vice president telling them how to do business when they're not employees and they don't need the money.
Yeah, well, that's why what he did was very remarkable. And he used that leverage that he has, is that he didn't need them necessarily from the outset. And when you have that kind of element at ESPN, which is very different from how most people there, most of the situations that they're in, most people there need ESPN, or the platform has helped them grow their brand in a way that it wasn't there before. But when you have a few outsized personalities who don't need the network, they're going to behave accordingly. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with what they're doing, but it is to say that when that power dynamic shifts, that's when things get more difficult. It's funny. Skip Bayless, of all people, told me this a long time ago. And this is when I was in my very early years at ESPN. I got to ESPN in 2006. And he said, one of the issues at the network is that he said they treat you differently depending on whether or not they feel like they made you. And his entire, we were just having sort of a casual conversation. And what he was basically saying is that, like, the people there that they feel like they are directly responsible for how their careers blossom, they tend to treat a certain way, versus the people who they know they're not so attached to being there, or the people who know that they didn't make them, that is, you get treated a little bit differently because you're going to carry yourself a little bit differently. There's a lot of people there who can't imagine their lives and careers without ESPN. I was always somebody who could. ESPN was never going to be my final resting place in this business. And so while the brand meant something to me and being there meant something to me, and I took pride in my work while I was there, ESPN was not the end all be all to me. And I think what happens is they have so much leverage over so much talent that is there, that there is this sort of fall in line that gets done there. And so a lot of times, and I'm sure this is why you heard from people outside of ESPN who no longer work there, and people even inside the building. So when you see a Pat McAfee that comes on that is a huge glitch in the matrix, you sort of perversely cheer for this type of conflict, because I laughed. I mean, that was my very first reaction. I laughed so hard when I saw that, like, oh yeah, this is about to get very, very interesting.